April the 18th, 1942. The North Pacific roared beneath the carrier USS Hornet as waves smashed against her hull, sending sprays of salt water over the flight deck. The gray dawn had barely broken, but every man on board knew this morning would be recorded in history, one way or another. On the horizon, the Japanese home islands waited, untouched, unprepared, and soon to be awakened. 16 twin-engine North American B-25B Mitchell bombers stood lashed to the deck, their olive-drab fuselages gleaming wet under the overcast light. These aircraft were never meant to fly from carriers. Their wingspans stretched over 20 meters, nearly the entire width of the flight deck. Yet here they were, packed nose to tail, engines idling against the wind, each carrying 400- or 500-pound bombs and just enough fuel for a one-way flight. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, 45 years old, former test pilot, aeronautical engineer, and racing legend, stood by the lead bomber's cockpit ladder, checking his watch. 08:20 hours. He glanced westward toward the endless gray horizon. They were still 1,050 kilometers farther out than planned. Japanese picket ships had spotted the task force earlier than expected. Admiral William Halsey had ordered, "Launch immediately." It meant suicide range. The B-25s would never have enough fuel to reach the designated recovery fields in China. The deck crews moved in rhythm, black figures against the pale sea. A final wave of the green flag. Engines thundered. Doolittle climbed into the cockpit, pulled his harness tight, and pushed the throttles forward. The B-25 trembled, wheels chocked, propellers clawing at the storm-laden air. Wind over deck, 40 knots. Distance available, barely 150 meters. At 08:25, the first bomber lurched forward. Sailors lined the deck, silent, fists clenched. The aircraft reached the bow, disappeared into spray, then rose impossibly into the mist. One by one, the 15 others followed. 16 heavy bombers climbing away from the carrier, their propellers slicing through low cloud, heading for Tokyo at wave-top height. On the Japanese coast, civilian fishermen saw dark specks emerging from the sea haze, flying impossibly low, engines echoing across the water. No alarms sounded. Japan's radar network, primitive and complacent, mistook them for reconnaissance planes from Formosa. At 12:25, the first bombs fell on Tokyo's industrial districts. Explosions tore through the Musashino aircraft plant, the Nakajima factory, the docks at Yokohama and Kobe. Fire spread through the capital, small in scale but devastating in meaning. For the first time in 2,600 years, the Emperor's city was under attack. Air raid sirens wailed too late. Civilians watched smoke curl above Tokyo Bay and felt what no Japanese citizen had ever imagined: vulnerability. Hundreds of kilometers away, aboard the Hornet, the carrier turned east, racing for safety. Behind her, 16 bombers disappeared into the gray, each crew uncertain whether they would ever see land again. The Doolittle raid had lasted barely 2 hours. The damage was minor, but its impact would shake an empire. Japan's confidence cracked that day, though few realized it yet. The shock had only begun. The plan had begun in rage. In December 1941, smoke still curled over Pearl Harbor when President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked his chiefs of staff a question that hung like a challenge: can we strike Japan back soon? The answer, by every measure of range, aircraft, and geography, was no. Japan sat behind an ocean fortress more than 6,000 kilometers away. No American bomber could reach it, but in January 1942, a slender Army Air Forces officer named James Doolittle walked into a meeting room at the Navy building in Washington with a simple, reckless idea. What if medium bombers could take off from an aircraft carrier? No one had ever attempted it. The Army's B-25 Mitchell was nearly 10 tons fully loaded, Designed for long runways, not the narrow steel decks of ships, the notion bordered on insanity. Admiral Ernest J. King, cold and skeptical, stared at Doolittle's proposal. "You're suggesting we put Army bombers on Navy carriers?" Doolittle nodded. "Sir, they only need to take off. They don't need to land." Behind that calm reply lay an engineering gamble that would test every law of aerodynamics and every nerve in the U.S. Navy. The concept, codenamed Special Aviation Project No. 1, began in total secrecy in February 1942. The Navy would provide the carrier, the Army Air Forces would provide the planes and crews. They would launch from 700 kilometers off Japan, strike Tokyo and other industrial centers, then continue west to airfields in free China. Every man involved knew it was a one-way mission. On February 3rd, Roosevelt approved the operation. His only instruction: hit them hard and return safely if you can. The president never used the words revenge or retaliation. In public, he remained composed, but privately, he demanded something to restore the nation's morale. A symbolic strike that would show the world America could reach across the Pacific. The operation demanded coordination between two services that rarely spoke to each other. The Navy's Task Force 16 would carry the bombers aboard USS Hornet, escorted by the carrier Enterprise and 16 warships. The Army Air Forces under General Henry Hap Arnold would modify the B-25s, training volunteer crews under strict secrecy at Eglin Field, Florida. Each detail bordered on impossible. The Mitchells required at least 450 meters for takeoff on land. Hornet's deck measured barely one-third of that. Their standard range, 2,400 kilometers, had to be stretched to 3,200. They would carry no defensive turrets, no armor plating, not even Norden bomb sights. Crews would navigate by dead reckoning and drift lines drawn on maps copied from National Geographic. In mid-March, 16 crews led by Doolittle gathered at Eglin under orders that revealed nothing. Their commanding officer told them only, "You will fly at very low altitude. You will not be told your target until departure." Rumors spread. Norway, the Philippines, even Berlin. Doolittle's men guessed the truth when they were told to memorize Japanese ship silhouettes and street layouts of Tokyo. One pilot, Lieutenant Ted Lawson, recorded in his diary, "We are being asked to do the impossible, but no one seems to care. Maybe that's why we'll pull it off." At the same time, Japanese intelligence was certain no American aircraft could reach the homeland. The Imperial Navy's own range calculations showed the nearest U.S. base at Midway to be over 2,000 kilometers from Tokyo. To them, the Pacific was a moat too wide for retaliation. Even Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, warned privately that the United States was not yet truly awake, that their industrial power, once aroused, would dwarf Japan's. But his caution was drowned in triumphal headlines. In early 1942, Japan stood at its zenith. Singapore had fallen, the Philippines were collapsing, and the imperial banners stretched from Burma to the Solomons. Within the War Ministry, officers toasted the emperor's invincibility. That arrogance would blind them to the small task force, now steaming west across the Pacific, hidden under a spring storm, carrying 16 Army bombers on a Navy ship, a combination so unlikely that no Japanese reconnaissance analyst even considered it. On April 2nd, USS Hornet departed San Francisco Bay, her decks covered with the olive-drab bombers, their propellers lashed against the wind. Sailors whispered among themselves that it looked like suicide. Doolittle met with the ship's captain, Mark Mitcher, on the bridge. "We'll make it work," he said simply. Behind that confidence lay months of quiet preparation and a single motive that no strategic briefing could quantify: morale. The operations planners knew its physical damage would be limited. Its real target was psychological, to remind the Japanese that the United States was still in the fight, and to remind Americans that defeat at Pearl Harbor had not broken their will. The Hornet sailed into the rising sun, engines humming, the Pacific stretching endless ahead. No one aboard could yet see the scale of consequence that would follow. Because when those 16 bombers lifted off, Japan would awaken, and the path to Midway would begin. The B-25 Mitchell was never built for a carrier. At full load, it weighed nearly 14 tons, its twin Wright R-2600 engines gulping fuel faster than any Navy aircraft. To make Doolittle's plan even remotely possible, every ounce had to be counted, cut, and stripped. At Eglin Field, Florida, mechanics worked day and night inside hangars sealed under military police guard. Armor plating was removed. Top and belly gun turrets were taken out entirely, replaced with mock wooden barrels to deceive enemy observers. Radio transmitters were simplified, oxygen bottles reduced, de-icing gear discarded. Even the Norden bomb sight, the prized American targeting device, was replaced by a 20-cent piece of metal pipe and a few crosshairs, hand-built by a bombardier named Captain Charles Ross Greening. He called it the Mark Twain, in place of weight, fuel. The B-25's normal capacity of 646 gallons grew to 1,141 by adding 4 collapsible rubber tanks in the bomb bay and crawlway, plus a 160-gallon tank in the tail. The fuel lines snaked across the floor like veins, gave a theoretical range of 2,500 kilometers, just enough on paper to bomb Tokyo and reach China with nothing left in reserve. The modification crews tested the results at Eglin's auxiliary strip, codenamed Runway Number 3, a mere 450 feet, 137 meters long, almost identical to a carrier deck. The first takeoff attempt nearly ended in disaster. The bomber wobbled, sagged off the runway, and cleared the surrounding pine trees by meters. "We learned fast," Greening later wrote. "Full power, full flaps, and faith." Each pilot practiced until muscle memory replaced fear. By March 1942, they could lift a Mitchell into the air in 450 feet, less than half its official requirement. The physics said impossible. Practice said otherwise. Then came the sea trials. On April 1st, the 16 aircraft were craned aboard USS Hornet at Alameda Naval Air Station. Sailors watched in disbelief as the first bomber was hoisted from dock to deck, its tail protruding over the carrier's bow. "What in God's name are those?" one deckhand muttered. "Army planes, and they're going to take off from here." Captain Mark Mitcher ordered tie-downs doubled. The Mitchell's wings overlapped, propellers barely clearing each other. The Hornet's own defensive fighters had been left behind to make room. For the first time in naval history, an American carrier sailed without its own air group. Below decks, engineers worried about the launch conditions. A loaded B-25 needed a 40-knot headwind to lift off safely. The carrier could provide 25 knots under full steam. The rest would have to come from the weather. Doolittle studied wind charts and prayed for a gale. On the morning of April the 18th, 1942, fortune delivered half of it. Rough seas meant headwinds, but also towering waves that made the deck pitch violently. The shortest takeoff run measured 467 feet, 142 meters. If the bombers didn't lift before the bow, they would vanish into the ocean. Doolittle climbed into the first aircraft, number 4023-4, codenamed Whiskey Pete. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Richard Cole, glanced down the deck, a ribbon of steel ending in gray water. The Hornet's speed was pushed to the limit. Wind 45 knots over the deck. At 0825, with flaps full and throttles wide, Doolittle released the brakes. The bomber lunged forward, tail dragging, engines screaming. Every crewman on deck held his breath. The aircraft rolled barely 150 meters, dipped off the bow, and vanished. Then, seconds later, it reappeared, climbing through spray. Cheers erupted across the ship. One after another, the remaining 15 followed. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's number 2 lifted off so close behind that his prop wash rocked Doolittle's tail. 2 bombers veered dangerously toward the island superstructure. Another nearly struck the forward gun turret. Yet all 16 cleared the deck. Below, sailors watched them disappear eastward until they became specks over the horizon. In the ready room, Mitcher's executive officer scribbled in his log, "All aircraft away. God help them." The technical achievement was astonishing. 16 land bombers airborne from a moving ship in heavy seas, the largest aircraft ever launched from a carrier. But the operation had crossed its first and only safety margin. They were 800 kilometers farther out than planned. Their extra fuel would not be enough. The crews knew it, but said nothing. Over the interphone, one bombardier muttered, "We'll make it somehow." Above the gray Pacific, 16 green aircraft droned westward, their engines synchronized like a formation heartbeat. Beneath them lay nothing but water and mathematics, the kind that rarely offered second chances. By the time the Japanese coast appeared through the haze, their gamble had already worked. Japan believed it was untouchable. In hours, 16 American bombers would prove otherwise. The Japanese coastline emerged from the morning haze just after noon. Pale sunlight shimmered across Tokyo Bay, and beyond it, a city that had never heard foreign bombers before. 16 aircraft split formation, each descending to treetop height. Below, fishermen froze as the sound of twin engines ripped across the surf. Low, fast, unannounced. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's lead B-25 roared in at 1,200 feet, 365 minnow, following Tokyo's Sumida River like a road. He saw smokestacks, tram lines, a dense grid of rooftops. At 12:25 p.m., his bombardier, Lieutenant Nolan Herndon, released 4 500-pound general-purpose bombs. 2 struck the Tokyo Arsenal complex, another hit a factory in the Shiba district. The last detonated near the Nihon Oil Company. Black smoke twisted into the sky. Doolittle turned south, skimming above power lines as anti-aircraft fire began to blossom around him. Across the city, people looked up in disbelief. Japanese civil defense systems were primitive. Sirens delayed, guns uncrewed, fighters unarmed. The capital had believed itself immune. The first explosions shattered that illusion. Flames rose over Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya. The second bomber, flown by Lieutenant Travis Hoover, hit the Nakajima Aircraft Works west of the city. Captain Edward York's crew bombed the Kawasaki dockyards at Yokohama. Others struck the steel mills and oil depots along Tokyo Bay, their bomb patterns wide but psychologically devastating. One bomb exploded near the Imperial Palace moat, sending fragments through palace windows. None of the raiders had expected to return alive, yet every one of them pressed their attack with calm precision. At 12:46 p.m., Japanese air defense units finally responded. Fighters scrambled from bases at Yokosuka and Choshi, Mitsubishi A6M-0s armed with 20mm cannon. But the raiders were already gone, racing west at a wave-top height. The Japanese interceptors, climbing to 20,000 feet, overshot completely. Radar operators mistook the few remaining blips for training flights. Confusion turned to panic as conflicting reports flooded naval headquarters. Enemy bombers over Tokyo, possible carrier east of Honshu. No visual confirmation. The Imperial Navy's combined fleet, spread across the western Pacific, preparing for future operations, abruptly shifted to emergency alert. Search planes were launched in every direction. No one realized the bombers were long past Tokyo, heading inland toward the mountains. For the men in the air, the adrenaline faded into grim calculation. The B-25s climbed to 6,000 feet, L1 1830, throttled back, and began the long leg across central Honshu. Fuel gauges dropped faster than expected. Headwinds, stronger than forecast, chewed into their reserves. Radio silence left them blind and alone, Captain Ted Lawson, flying aircraft number 7, the ruptured duck, noted in his log. Fuel needles dropping fast. China still 1,000 miles away. We'll never make it. He could see snow-capped peaks ahead, the Japanese Alps rising into thick cloud. The bombers threaded the valleys, engines echoing between ridges. Some passed within meters of mountaintops. Others overflew small towns whose inhabitants stared upward in shock. Over the Sea of Japan, the weather turned vicious. Heavy rain, 40-knot crosswinds, and darkness approaching. Navigators estimated their position by dead reckoning alone. The auxiliary fuel tanks were almost dry. Doolittle's aircraft, first in line, reached the Chinese coast after midnight. He ordered the crew to bail out at 9,000 feet, 2,540 miles. They jumped into a black void, rain lashing, with no idea whether they were over friendly territory or enemy-occupied ground. Across the formation, chaos. One aircraft crash-landed off the coast of China. Another ditched near Wenzhou. 2, forced off course, landed in Soviet territory and were interned for months. Others vanished entirely. Japanese searchlights probed the night sky over Kyushu and Shikoku. Too late. The attackers were gone. Tokyo burned in isolated patches, limited destruction, yet immeasurable humiliation. The nation that had struck Pearl Harbor without warning now faced the first foreign bombs to ever fall on its soil. By morning, Imperial broadcast stations announced a minor air raid by enemy planes. Censorship hid the truth. But the shock inside Japan's War Council was profound. The psychological equation had reversed. If American bombers could reach Tokyo once, they could do it again and next time in greater numbers. 16 bombers had dropped barely 16 tons of bombs, yet they had detonated something far larger, the myth of Japan's invulnerability. The empire's leaders gathered in Tokyo that night, their composure strained, their pride wounded. And the man whose name they barely knew, Doolittle, had just forced them to rethink the entire war. Night swallowed the Pacific coast as the B-25 crews crossed into darkness. Rain drummed against the canopies, turbulence shaking the airframe like dice in a cup. Each pilot knew the numbers. 2,500 kilometers, already flown, almost no fuel remaining. Their gauges hovered near zero. Somewhere ahead lay China, if the winds didn't push them into the Yellow Sea first. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle was the first to confront the inevitable. His aircraft had flown for 13 hours, engines sputtering on fumes. At 12:30 a.m., with no visual references and storms closing in, he gave the order no pilot wants to say, bail out. The crew opened the hatch and dropped into the void one by one, parachutes snapping open in the freezing wind. Doolittle was the last to jump. He landed hard on a terrace slope, tumbling into the mud. The storm raged above him. When dawn came, he found himself in a bamboo grove, soaked, bruised but alive, and surrounded by Chinese farmers who stared in astonishment at the stranger who had fallen from the sky. Elsewhere, the fate of the other 15 bombers unfolded across hundreds of miles. Some crashed into mountain ridges, others ditched in rivers. Crewmen crawled from shattered fuselages, hiding from Japanese patrols. Of the 80 men who had launched that morning, 73 reached China alive. 8 were captured. 3 were executed after mock trials in occupied Shanghai. 1 died in captivity. The survivors endured starvation, interrogation, and brutal marches through occupied territory before being rescued by Chinese resistance fighters. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's crew of the ruptured duck crash-landed on a beach near Ningbo. The impact tore the nose section apart, killing the gunner and nearly severing Lawson's leg. Local villagers carried the survivors inland on makeshift stretchers, hiding them from Japanese search parties. Lawson later wrote in his memoir, "We had bombed Tokyo. Now Japan was burning China to find us." The Japanese response was immediate and merciless. Convinced that the raiders had received aid from Chinese civilians, the Imperial Army launched what became known as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Campaign, a 6-week scorched earth operation across eastern China. Entire villages suspected of sheltering American airmen were annihilated. Historians estimate that more than 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in reprisals. The Doolittle Raid, intended as a symbol of courage, had triggered one of the most brutal punitive campaigns of the war. For the Americans who survived, rescue came through an extraordinary network of Chinese partisans and missionaries. Guided by candlelight through flooded rice fields, the airmen were smuggled across rivers and mountains to free China, where the nationalist government sheltered them. Weeks later, they were flown to Chongqing and then to India. When Doolittle finally reported to General Hap Arnold, he apologized, convinced the mission had failed. Every bomber was lost, the damage minimal. Arnold shook his head. "Jimmy," he said, "you've given this country something it hasn't had since Pearl Harbor: hope." News of the raid broke in the United States on April 21st. Newspapers ran headlines in letters large enough to fill entire pages. "Tokyo bombed." The details were sparse. Roosevelt refused to reveal where the bombers had launched. When reporters pressed him, he smiled slightly and said, "They came from Shangri-La." The phrase stuck. Across America, factories paused, church bells rang, and morale surged. The idea that U.S. bombers could strike Japan's capital only 4 months after Pearl Harbor electrified the nation. Back in Tokyo, the opposite occurred. The attack humiliated the Imperial Army and Navy. None of Japan's vaunted defenses had stopped it. The Emperor's ministers demanded answers. The Army blamed the Navy for failing to detect the carriers. The Navy blamed the Army for inadequate air patrols. Admiral Yamamoto, furious and shaken, convened an emergency meeting of the combined fleet. "If we cannot defend our Emperor's own city," he said, "then we must destroy the enemy's fleet before it strikes again." That decision set Japan on a fatal course. To restore honor and eliminate the American carriers that had dared approach their shores, Yamamoto began planning an operation far to the east, one that would lure the U.S. Navy into a decisive ambush. The location was an atoll midway between Hawaii and Japan. By the time Doolittle's surviving crews reached home, celebrated as heroes, Japan was already preparing to strike again, this time at Midway. The raid had lasted less than 12 hours. Its echoes would define the next 3 years of war. The morning after the raid, Tokyo's sky still carried a faint haze of smoke. Damage reports filtered in through a maze of sensors and embarrassed officials. Only a few industrial buildings destroyed, minor fires contained. Yet the shock ran deeper than any number on paper. For the first time, Japan's citizens had seen foreign aircraft over their capital. The sense of divine protection, cultivated through centuries of imperial mythology, had shattered in a single afternoon. At the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito received briefings from Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and senior naval officers. The reports were stripped of emotion, but their faces betrayed disbelief. Tojo's intelligence staff insisted the attack must have come from an island base in the Aleutians or the Philippines. "Impossible from a ship," one officer said. Yamamoto knew better. The radar traces, the direction of approach, the timing, all pointed to a carrier force that had ventured within striking distance of Honshu itself. In the halls of the Naval General Staff, arguments erupted. Admiral Nagano Osami demanded harsher homeland defenses. Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, urged immediate offensive action to destroy the American carriers before they could strike again. "They are emboldened," he wrote in his diary, and we must answer at once, or the people will lose faith in the Navy. Publicly, the government minimized the incident. Japanese newspapers published only brief lines. A small enemy air attack on several localities. Damage negligible. But privately, fear spread through the highest councils. Civil defense officials reported unprecedented panic among Tokyo's citizens. Evacuations, false alarms, rumors of more raids. For the first time since the Meiji Restoration, Japan's leadership confronted the possibility that the war might reach their own soil. Admiral Yamamoto took it personally. A perfectionist and gambler by nature, he viewed the raid as both insult and warning. His own prediction, made months earlier, had come true too soon. For 6 months after the start of hostilities, I can run wild. After that, I have no confidence. Now, less than 5 months after Pearl Harbor, his home islands had been bombed. In his flagship, Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima, Yamamoto summoned his staff on April 20th. He ordered preparations accelerated for Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Atoll. The Americans must be drawn out and annihilated, he told them. We will strike at the heart of their Pacific defense. To the officers present, it was clear that honor, not strategy, now guided his resolve. The Doolittle raid had exposed the Empire's deepest weakness, its intelligence blindness. Japanese coastal watchers had failed to detect Hornet and Enterprise as they approached. Picket ships were too few, their radios outdated, their reports ignored. The Navy's reconnaissance doctrine, focused on offense, had left the homeland vulnerable. Over the following weeks, the response bordered on hysteria. Hundreds of new observation posts were ordered along Japan's eastern coastline. Anti-aircraft batteries were redeployed from Manchuria. School children drilled with bamboo poles, practicing how to extinguish incendiary bombs. Newspapers urged citizens to be vigilant for enemy agents and traitors signaling from rooftops. Behind the propaganda, paranoia took hold. In cabinet meetings, Army officers whispered that the Navy had failed the Emperor. Navy ministers retorted that Army arrogance had left Japan overstretched across Asia. The fragile cooperation that had carried Japan to victory in 1941 began to fracture. Yamamoto pushed forward anyway. His staff finalized plans for a vast operation involving 4 carriers, 2 battleships, heavy cruisers, and hundreds of aircraft. The objective, seize Midway, destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and extend Japan's defensive perimeter another 2,000 kilometers eastward. The reasoning was partly strategic, but more than anything, psychological. Japan needed to prove to its own people that the Doolittle humiliation was an anomaly, not a prophecy. In the Navy's classified war journal, a single line captured the mood. The attack on Tokyo was minor in damage, but immense in consequence. It demands redemption. To ordinary Japanese citizens, the government's silence felt unnatural. Why had they been unprepared? Why had the air raid sirens failed? Some whispered that the gods had withdrawn their protection. By early May, as search patrols combed the northern Pacific in vain for American carriers, Yamamoto's staff finalized the date, June 4th, 1942. The operation would proceed even as intelligence officers warned that the Americans might already know. The Doolittle raid had not crippled Japan's industry. It had crippled its judgment. What began as an act of retaliation now drove the empire toward the most decisive naval battle in modern history, one it could not afford to lose. Japan had been shocked awake, but the awakening would come at a terrible price. In Washington, the morning newspapers carried one headline that changed the country's mood overnight. U.S. bombers strike Tokyo. 4 words that erased months of humiliation. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose a surge of pride so fierce that even the Pentagon was caught off guard. Americans didn't know who had done it, how it had been done, or where the planes had come from, but it didn't matter. For the first time since December 7th, the nation felt the tide turn. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat before reporters in the Oval Office 2 days later, his tone calm, his eyes hard. Asked how bombers could reach Japan, he smiled faintly. "They came from Shangri-La," he said. The remark was deliberate, a deflection to preserve operational secrecy and a jab at Japan's intelligence network. The phrase from James Hilton's 1933 novel instantly entered legend. It became shorthand for the impossible feat America had somehow accomplished. Behind the secrecy, Washington spun the operation into a weapon of morale. The Office of War Information prepared posters and radio scripts celebrating the men who took war to Tokyo. Doolittle's name was withheld for security, but whispers spread quickly. The story of Army bombers taking off from a Navy carrier became mythic almost overnight. In factories across the country, production lines stopped as loudspeakers announced the raid's success. Women working on B-24 assembly lines in Fort Worth cheered. Steelworkers in Pittsburgh hung banners that read, "Remember Pearl Harbor, remember Tokyo." Children donated coins to buy war bonds. Communities renamed streets Doolittle Drive. The impact went far beyond morale. Military planners, watching Japan's overreaction, realized the raid had strategic value no one had anticipated. Yamamoto's decision to seek a decisive carrier battle meant the initiative had shifted. America would now have a chance to fight on terms of its choosing. Still, within the War Department, not everyone celebrated blindly. General Hap Arnold understood how close the mission had come to disaster. All 16 bombers lost, 3 men dead, 8 missing. The official communiques emphasized courage and success, but omitted the cost. Privately, Arnold cabled Doolittle, "Your mission will live in every airman's heart. You have shown the world our reach exceeds our wounds." Doolittle, however, believed he would face a court-martial. "We lost every airplane," he told his superiors, and cost the Navy a carrier task force's safety. Instead, Roosevelt promoted him to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "For conspicuous leadership, gallantry, and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty." Across the Pacific, American propagandists exploited the raid to its fullest. Radio Tokyo's frantic denials, insisting the damage was trivial, only amplified the psychological victory. U.S. broadcasters replayed intercepted Japanese bulletins to demonstrate confusion inside the empire. Leaflets dropped over occupied territories in the Pacific read, "Tokyo burned. We are coming." The propaganda worked. Morale surveys taken by the Army showed a 23% jump in public optimism about victory within a single week. War bond sales spiked. The Navy received a surge of recruits. The psychological shift was immediate. Americans now believed Japan could bleed. In China, Chiang Kai-shek's government seized on the raid as proof of Allied solidarity. Newspapers in Chongqing printed photographs of B-25 wreckage as symbols of American sacrifice for Asia's liberation. Yet behind the triumph, Chinese villages paid the price. Yamamoto's punitive operations killed hundreds of thousands in retribution for helping the raiders. American intelligence reports recorded it coldly. Civilian suffering immense, Japanese fury disproportionate. In Washington, those lines never reached the newspapers. The story America needed was one of redemption, not consequence. The nation had endured Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Bataan. It required victory, even symbolic, to carry it through the long years ahead. The Doolittle raid became that symbol, a demonstration that the United States could strike anywhere, no matter the odds. By summer 1942, Hollywood had already begun production on 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. Magazines published romanticized sketches of the crews, clean uniforms, determined eyes, captions like, "The first Americans over Japan." Reality was harsher, most of the men still recovering from injuries or captivity, haunted by what they had seen. But America needed heroes, and the Doolittle Raiders became living proof that defeat was not destiny. As factories thundered and shipyards worked around the clock, Roosevelt's promise echoed through every speech. "The American people will fight until our enemies learn what we have begun." For Japan, that sentence was a warning. For America, it was a vow. And far across the Pacific, Yamamoto's fleet was already steaming toward a place called Midway, driven by pride, hunted by fate. The men who had lifted off from USS Hornet that gray April morning never saw themselves as heroes. Most were young, barely in their 20s, mechanics, farmers, engineers who had volunteered for a mission with no guarantee of return. When they finally came home, many couldn't believe the headlines. They were met with parades, medals, and Roosevelt's handshake, but each carried private memories that no celebration could cleanse. Lieutenant Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, would later say, "We weren't thinking about glory. We just didn't want Pearl Harbor to be the last word." In total, 14 of the 80 raiders were killed in action, 8 captured, and 3 executed. Yet their impact rippled across the Pacific in ways no one could have foreseen. In Tokyo, the raid had shattered the illusion of safety. In Washington, it had forged the conviction that America's will to fight could never again be underestimated. Doolittle himself went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, then the 15th in Italy, and finally the 8th Air Force in Europe, overseeing thousands of heavy bombers that reduced the Nazi war machine to rubble. The man who once thought he would be court-martialed ended the war as a lieutenant general and a national legend. For Japan, the psychological wound never fully healed. The Doolittle raid exposed how vulnerable the empire truly was. It forced leaders to divert precious resources to homeland defense, building radar networks, dispersing aircraft, and hoarding fuel that could no longer be spared for offensive operations. And worse, it hardened their resolve for a decisive battle that led them straight into catastrophe at Midway. In the years that followed, survivors of the raid met quietly. Refusing to call themselves heroes, they gathered in modest hotel banquet rooms, raising silver goblets engraved with each man's name. One by one, as age claimed them, the surviving raiders turned each goblet upside down. At their final reunion in 2013, only 4 remained. They drank a final toast to those who are gone. In China, the price of their heroism lingered longer. Entire villages wiped out by Japanese reprisals. Families executed for offering food or shelter to downed Americans. It would take decades before the U.S. government publicly acknowledged their sacrifice. When Doolittle visited China after the war, he bowed deeply before the families of those who had died helping his men escape. "Their courage was greater than ours," he said softly. The raid's echoes traveled even farther. It reshaped strategy on both sides of the Pacific. For America, it proved that audacity, married to industrial power, could achieve the impossible. For Japan, it demonstrated that honor pursued without caution leads only to ruin. Decades later, historians would analyze the Doolittle raid not as a military triumph, but as a turning point of psychology, a spark that reignited a nation's will. Its success wasn't measured in tons of bombs, but in the belief it restored. From the wreckage of 16 bombers rose the certainty that the United States would not simply survive the war, it would define its end. In 1988, standing beneath the wings of a preserved B-25 at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, Doolittle, then in his 80s, was asked what he remembered most about that day. He looked up at the bomber's metal skin, smiled faintly, and said, "I remember the sound of the engines. That's the sound of men who refuse to quit." Those engines had carried more than bombs. They carried a message across an ocean. That courage, when joined with imagination, can strike further than fear ever expects. History rarely turns on the size of the strike. More often, it turns on the willingness to act when reason says not to. The Doolittle raid was never about destroying factories or sinking ships. It was about proving that defeat was not permanent. It showed that even in the darkest hour, a handful of men, with the right machines, the right resolve, and the audacity to try, could shake an empire awake. Japan had misjudged America's heart. They believed comfort bred weakness, that democracy softened the will to fight. What they saw over Tokyo's sky was something else entirely. Industrial power fueled by moral outrage, discipline bound to innovation, and courage wrapped in quiet defiance. The raid's bombs burned only briefly, but their shock ignited something far larger, the awakening of an industrial giant. Within 3 years, the same nation that had scrambled to assemble 16 bombers on a single carrier deck would command fleets of hundreds, striking across 2 oceans simultaneously. Yet beneath the machinery and strategy lies something simpler: the persistence of ordinary people faced with impossible odds. The men who flew toward Japan knew they would likely die, but they did it anyway. That kind of courage doesn't end with history books. It endures as a reminder of what conviction looks like when the world collapses around you. 80 men took off into a storm and changed the course of a global war. The empire they struck would never be the same, and neither would the nation they served. What moment do you think truly showed Japan that America's fight had only begun?